Our next half hour or so is going to belong to Mr. Jeff Childers, who is an attorney from Gainesville. Go Gators. And the one thing he shared with me last night that I think every doctor up here agrees is that he said his life, well, my life was never really cushy or relaxed, but his life was pretty relaxed until COVID. I mean, his wife was saying he's working all hours of the night because of what's happened with COVID, and frankly, that's true of all of the physicians here. I mean, when we were in San Juan, someone insinuated that some of us might be profiting off of what we're doing. And I said to this gentleman, please, I said, we wish COVID never happened, that we could go back to being the doctors we were, taking care of the patients we have. But we're overwhelmed, and we're overwhelmed a lot because we don't have enough men and women of courage like Dr. Cole and Dr. Gessling and others out there. So that's what this event's all about. Mr. Childers, come up here and explain a bit about vaccine exemptions, vaccine mandates, and after that, we're going to have an interesting panel. We're going to bring several of the folks up here, and it's going to be a moderated panel by a surprise moderator. So here we go. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We'll get there. Hey, everybody. So this is kind of surreal for me. 18 months ago, I would not have guessed I'd be doing anything like this. And I bet I wouldn't have guessed that all of you guys would be spending your Saturday listening. Not listening to a bunch of doctors. Okay, cut back on again. I'll just try this one for now. And, you know, all these slides about DNA and all that stuff, that's how you always wanted to spend your Saturday, right? So it's two of us. What a great venue, right? It's like I've never even been out here before, so let's give them a hand. And I want to thank all the people who traveled to get here. I know many of our speakers traveled great distances to come to Florida, and we really disappointed them with the bad weather, didn't we? You know, but the silver lining is, with bad weather, that means American and Southwest are flying, right? Since is that, yeah, something like that, anyway. I do want to do a shout out to my Coffee and COVID folks. I know there's a bunch of you guys there. Yes, and I see those t-shirts. I want one of those t-shirts. That's awesome. You guys will have to read if you want to understand the joke. And before I start on my topic, I did need a little bit of help. I seem to have misplaced something, and so if anybody sees it, I left my spare spike proteins around here somewhere. So if you just kind of push them to the side with your foot or something like that. Anyway, I'm here today to talk about medical and religious exemptions. I've been handling these issues in my practice for what seems like ages. It's probably been about 6 months. We're to the point now where we have so many people calling in, we have to batch them up and handle them with a minimum of 10 at a time. And I have another attorney who's doing that and giving people advice about these topics. And I wanted to talk about some parts of this that I haven't really talked about before, and I want to offer some practical advice. And I have medical professionals here, and I know a lot of our medical professionals are being asked to write these letters and to fill out these forms and everything, and you want to try to help people. And you know, you're concerned about putting the right thing down, or you know, it being rejected, and is it your fault for how you filled it out? I'm sure you have many of those kinds of questions. So I'm going to do my best in a difficult environment to give you some practical advice. And I think it's really important that we understand the context. These issues of these exemptions exist in a sort of bizarre no man's land between law and public policy. What I mean by that is, you have to understand how we got here. So the federal government absolutely cannot mandate vaccination, and I don't care what Jacobson versus Massachusetts says. They can't do it. And they know they can't do it, and that's why they've been playing all these games and getting other people to do it for them. So if you think back to your old life, your life before COVID, there were 3 scenarios where mandated vaccination was acceptable, right? If you think about it. So one of them was in the military, right? And the government just exercised raw power against military members, and there's some famous cases, and a lot of, folks, our veterans will talk about getting the anthrax vaccine and some of the problems that caused, right? So you've got that model. That model will not work for the federal government. It's unconstitutional against citizens who aren't in the military. When you enter the military, you sign your rights away, but the rest of us haven't done that. Then there's the school vaccine model. So we've been doing this for a long time, right? And there are lots of organizations like Robert Kennedy's group who lobby against these school vaccine mandates, but the school vaccine mandate model is making people show evidence of vaccination to enter. And what does that sound like? That's your vaccine passport, right? That was the first thing they tried. The first thing they tried was to follow the school vaccination model, except to spread it out to restaurants and public buildings and entertainment venues and everything else. They thought they were going to do it that way because that was a less difficult way, they thought. It didn't work, right? There was massive pushback against the passports. States like Florida and Texas banned them, and probably a bunch of other states I'm not thinking about right now. So they had to come up with a new way. And you remember the former vice president said while he was campaigning that there would be no mandates, right? And that took about 10 minutes before he changed his mind, if his mind is changing. All right, now let me tell the jokes. So they had to move to the third model that we already had, which is the hospital influenza vaccine model. Right, so for about 10 or 20 years, hospitals more and more have been mandating that their healthcare workers take these influenza vaccines, right? And there is, believe it or not, a lot of case law on that. And I was shocked when I finally started digging into some of the influenza vaccine case law to find the language that I see on all these forms that come from the government and from these employers. So they were way ahead of us. They had gone over all of those cases, and they have some kind of a brief or a package that they give to employers to help them, walk through the legal minefield. And I say it's a legal minefield, and it was their third choice because it raises some problems. And 2 of the problems that it raises is that there are these big areas of law, 2 different ones, that come into play with these types of policies, these hospital influenza policies, because in all these cases, there's a lot of stuff that we're not going to like too much, but there's also a lot of protective stuff, and they come in the form of religious exemptions and medical exemptions to the influenza vaccine. So they knew they had to do it. And it's especially problematic because both of those areas of law impose significant money liability on private employers who don't do it right. And so the federal government knew that it needed to use these private employers to push its vaccines out, but it knew the private employers would resist because they would have potential liability if they did it wrong. So I don't know for sure. I'm speculating on this one, but from what I see in my practice, it looks pretty clear to me that there is some kind of central planning going on, and that resources are being provided to all of these private employers, especially the larger ones, because what I see over and over again is very consistent behavior from employer to employer in radically different industries on two different coasts, companies that have nothing to do with each other, using the same language and the same forms and things like that. So what are those two areas of law? Well, the first one is Title VII. And Title VII guarantees to employees First Amendment protections, among other things, for religious beliefs. And it provides that employers may not discriminate against the religious beliefs of their employees if those beliefs interfere with job responsibilities. And the employer is required to provide, as you guys probably well know, an accommodation. Right? On the other hand, the medical exemption arises from a completely different area of law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's premised on the idea that if an employee has a medical disability that prevents them from performing some function of their job, that the employer, again, has to provide an accommodation. Okay? And really, those two areas of law don't have a whole lot to do with each other. But we think about them together now because they're the two exemptions. And so you always hear them talked about in the same sentence. So there are some basic concepts. And the basic concepts are, number one, sincerity, which applies to how they look at your religious belief if you're asking for a religious exemption. And on the other hand, undue hardship, which is the way to determine whether an employer has to accommodate an employee. So there's this term of undue hardship. If it's too difficult to accommodate the employee, then the employer's off the hook. So what happened from the beginning of this thing is we saw the employers with their forms and everything trying to shoehorn employees into making admissions that disqualified them under either of those two prongs. So let me take the two exemptions separately, and I want to give you some information and tell you about some of the case law. So with regard to medical exemptions in particular, let's do that one first. So Title I of the ADA provides that covered entities, which includes private employers, are prohibited from, quote, discriminating against a qualified individual on the basis of disability in regard to the hiring, advancement, or discharge of employees, right? So that includes from the hiring stage to the termination stage. In other words, the Americans with Disabilities Act comes into play when a recognized medical condition interferes with an employee's ability to carry out their job. Now the key word, and this is where we're going to get into where we're wrangling with the employers right now, is on that recognized part. Let me say a word about natural immunity. Guess whether natural immunity is a recognized medical condition under the Americans with Disabilities Act as we sit here today. I'm just giving you one guess. Come on, can you do it? No, that's right. You guys are too good. All right, I'm gonna have to make the next one harder. There is a limited disability that's recognized. So if you've had COVID infection, which you can show by a positive test or by an antibody test within 90 days, then they'll wait out the 90 days. And then you still have to take the shot. So you get this kind of temporary disability. That's as much as they recognize natural immunity. Now, where did they come up with the 90 days? Well, Dr. Fauci said it, so it must be true. There's a very recent case. This rule has been challenged. So in Burcham versus the City of Los Angeles, which was just entered on October 27th. The court held that a challenge to this rule was premature because in that case, the employer hadn't made its final determination on whether it was going to grant medical exemptions based on natural immunity. So that case didn't go anywhere, but it's interesting. And the employer had previously denied the medical exemptions, but told the court it was reconsidering them. So that maybe that's an indication that we're going somewhere or getting somewhere. I would like to see a real case brought with evidence put on, to show that this 90-day rule is arbitrary, capricious, and irrational. We'll do it. We'll get around to it if somebody else doesn't. There's a federal form that's used for federal employees, and I think it's a good example. So for healthcare providers, this is what you're probably going to see, something like this on a form that one of your patients brings you. The federal form has 3 categories of recognized medical conditions that provide for a valid medical exemption. I'm just going to read you the language, and I apologize, this isn't my language, this is how the feds do it, right? It says, the first category is the applicable contraindication or precaution for COVID-19 vaccination, and for each contraindication or precaution, indicate A, whether it's recognized by the CDC pursuant to its guidance, so if it's on the CDC website somewhere, and, not or, B, whether it is listed in the package insert, good luck finding that, or the EUA fact sheet for each of the COVID-19 vaccines authorized or approved for use. Okay, so that's the first one. You have to be able to identify it in the list that we've been provided. Number 2, a statement that the individual's condition and medical circumstances relating to the individual are such that COVID-19 vaccination is not considered safe. That sounds promising, right? Indicating the specific nature of the medical condition or circumstances that contraindicate immunization with a COVID-19 vaccine or might increase the risk for a serious adverse reaction. So the key to that one is being specific. And, what does that mean? Do you need to put a, Medicare diagnosis code on there, or billing code, something like that? Probably. Finally, any other medical condition that would limit the employee from receiving any COVID-19 vaccine. And that's a tough one too. So those aren't particularly helpful. My suggestion to you would be, obviously, the greater specificity, the better. The more likely that exemption is going to be approved. Obviously, you can see they're doing their best to limit your ability to identify what those contraindications could be. So there are some, maybe other pointers that I would give in a one-on-one type of situation rather than in a public venue like this. Let's talk about religious exemptions. Now, the religious exemption is probably the stronger of the two. It is, after all, based on the U.S. Constitution, so it's a constitutional issue, and reinforced by Title VII. The standard is as follows. To establish a prima facie case of religious discrimination, a plaintiff must show a sincere religious belief that conflicts with an employment requirement. Okay, so there's that word sincerity that we were talking about. What are they saying? Obviously, what's the opposite of sincerity? Insincerity, what they mean is you can't just make it up, right? You can't worship the golden hedgehog and qualify for your religious exemption. They won't take that. Now, they don't want to grant any religious exemptions. But that's a problem for the employers. Because if they don't grant any, that is prima facie evidence of religious discrimination. It's great evidence of religious discrimination. I could win that case all day long. I wish they would do that. So they have to grind their teeth and approve some, right? So by now, probably everybody in this giant room is familiar with all of these forms and the websites with the questions that they ask, and then they want to do follow-up questions and all of that stuff. So where are these questions coming from? What are they looking for? What are they trying to get at? Well, just as an example, I got a case, and I'm going to read some parts of these cases to you guys so you can see. Again, these are the cases that were already available before all this started, that I believe all of this stuff is built on, is language from these cases. In International Society for Krishna Consciousness versus Barber from the Second Circuit, the court commented that the sincerity of professed religious belief could be undercut by extrinsic evidence of conduct that is inconsistent with that belief. Right? So the employer is allowed to try to prove that you're a hypocrite. And if they can prove you're a hypocrite, then your religious belief can't be sincere, can it? Right? So these forms are designed to try to gather information for the employers to use to prove inconsistency between the stated belief and the employee's conduct. Right? So that's why they're asking what other medications you've taken, if you've ever been immunized in the past, have your kids been immunized, and so forth, right? That's where they're going with that. So let me read to you a few paragraphs, and I'll read them and I'll talk about them one by one, from a case called NM, which was the anonymous initials of the plaintiff, versus Hebrew Academy of Long Beach. This is from the Eastern District of New York in 2016. And what the case was about was some parents at a Jewish school who didn't want to vaccinate their kids. This is a school vaccination case. Remember, that's where we are now. We're using that law. So the court said, quote, her reasons for not vaccinating the minors, her children, were based on perceived health concerns and not sincere religious convictions. Now, how did the court conclude that? Listen to what the court said. In this regard, the principal testified that in the judgment of the committee, the motivations of the plaintiffs were medically oriented and not religious. He testified that the plaintiff apparently believed that she had a better way to protect the minor's health, which was through diet, and that introducing a foreign substance was not something she thought was a good idea from a health perspective. Now, these are just comments that this woman made in her deposition. NM asserts that these commandments, these alleged Jewish law commandments, are inconsistent with the practice of vaccinating, which by its nature involves puncturing the skin, introducing a foreign substance into the bloodstream, and undermining the Jewish belief that our natural immune system is sufficient to ward off disease. So that was how she explained it. That was how she explained her sincere religious belief. So they challenged her in her deposition about the fact that she had used other medical treatments in the past, which included injections, puncturing the skin, and things like that, right? Showing inconsistency. So here's what the court said, quote, it was brought out on cross-examination that despite her reliance on Jewish teachings against making cuttings in the skin, NM has her ears pierced. It was also brought out that NM had permitted herself to be injected with the Novocaine drug during dental procedures. Also, the court noted, the minors used sunscreen, which NM agreed was a preventative to prevent them from getting sunburn, which in later life can cause cancer. It was also brought out that she ingested, get this, prenatal vitamin supplements during her pregnancies because they are practically required by every doctor. In this regard, she testified that in order to guard their health, her family takes a lot of dietary nutritional precautions including keeping sugar out of their diet and following healthy dietary recommendations. All of that was used as evidence to prove she did not have a sincere religious belief. The court said the church with which the plaintiff was affiliated, namely the Church of the Beloved, took no position on the propriety of vaccination and had not instructed the plaintiff that she could not get her daughter immunized for school. This is why they're asking the questions about what does your faith tradition say about vaccination, and they're asking for your pastor letter. Right? They're trying to find inconsistency between your church's position and your position. At a hearing, it was revealed that the mother also objected to vaccinations because she was unsure whether they were safe or can cause autism. So she admitted that she wasn't sure if they asked her the question, this is how it must have gone in the depot, are the vaccines safe? And she said, I'm not sure. And the court used that as evidence that her concerns were more health concerns and not religious concerns. Further, the court noted that although the mother felt that the body was God's perfect creation, she conceded that she had taken Motrin and essential oils, and she had administered those to her daughter, thereby, listen to what the court said, indicating a selective personal belief, not a religious belief. Now, the court gave them a little olive branch. It allowed this. It said the court does not doubt that NM and her husband hold a genuine and sincere belief that they should not vaccinate the minors. That's very, generous of the court, don't you think? As this court acknowledged in Caviezel, NM's beliefs in this regard are real and understandable. However, the court said, careful consideration of the current record suggests these beliefs were formed with a primary view towards the children's health and not their religion. In this regard, the record clearly does not support a finding that Orthodox Judaism, even as interpreted by these particular plaintiffs, forbids the practice. You guys are getting the idea, right? So this is the stuff that the government lawyers were reading when they put this whole religious exemption package together. They were going through cases like this one, and they were pulling out examples like the ones I just read you. And that's why we're seeing those kinds of questions and requests for documents that we're seeing. So, hello. Let me give you some practical suggestions with regard to religious exemption requests. And this is going to be appropriate also for our medical staff here because, as you know, the new Biden mandates from CMS are coming down. So all of us are going to be in that same boat, right, if we're not already there. The first thing that I tell people, and by the way, I have a lot of guidance on this on my blog. It's www.coffeeandcovid.com. There's a tab that says resources or something like that. And under that tab, you'll find the different posts that I've written about religious exemption letters, including a full example of how I, as an attorney, would write one for myself. But the first thing I tell people is show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. Show your religious belief. Don't tell them how religious you are. You see what I'm saying there? So the first question might be, explain the basis of your religious belief, right? And you're going to be tempted to say, well, I'm a Christian and I attend Celebrity Baptist Church and I, serve on this committee and this kind of thing, right? Well, if your religion is Christianity, and I'm going to use that example because I'm a Christian and so I know that one the best, but this would apply whatever your faith tradition. and they ask you, what is the basis of your religious belief? Shouldn't you say something more like, I believe that God created the universe and that something broke and sin and death came into the world, and then he sent his only begotten Son to take the punishment for all of us so that we could be saved, and if we trust and believe in him, live forever. That's explaining the basis of your religious belief. And it's a chance to evangelize a little. I really just like to slide that in there. So as you approach all the remaining questions, you need to be very cognizant, Christian, how Scripture tells you to answer those questions, right? So for example, now I've advised every kind of person you can imagine from every walk of life. I've advised top management personnel from big pharma companies, including at least one of the companies that makes one of the approved vaccines. I have personally advised that person on their religious exemption request. I've advised oil workers, airplane pilots, any kind of healthcare worker you can think of, cops, firefighters, electrical workers, linemen, you name it. And so I've seen all kinds of examples of poorly written exemption requests. But the one that really sticks out was a JetBlue pilot. And he actually did a pretty good job at the first part. Can you guys in the back hear me? Yeah, okay, they put their thumbs up. My wife's like, they can't hear you. I'll talk louder. Thanks, honey. So this JetBlue pilot, he writes this letter, and he does a pretty good job, but it gets to the last paragraph. And the last paragraph starts like this. It says, if I lose this job, it would be devastating for our family. I don't know what we would do. It would be the worst thing that ever happened to us, and more in that vein. Right? And I was like, okay, we have a little bit of a problem here. Right? Because you did a wonderful job explaining what a great Christian you are. And then you get to this last part, and it doesn't sound like you're putting your trust in God very much. It sounds like you're putting your trust in JetBlue. Right? I said, so let's change this paragraph. I was like, I have a great idea. Let's put, I trust in God, so whatever you guys need to do, that's fine with me. So let's put that. We'll be okay, because God's going to provide for us whatever happens. And oh man, he was like, that's practically daring them to fire me. I'm like, yes, but you're showing. Show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. And again, for an example, you can check on my blog and see how I did it. The second point I would give you, with the limited time that I have left, John, I'm aware, is avoid all these health-related points. You guys just heard that case I read you. If that wasn't mortifying enough, let me just tell you, don't talk about the health issues in your religious exemption forms. Keep a firewall. If you're asking for both, if you're asking for a medical and a religious, do not mix them together, because they will use that logic from the case that I just read you to say, well, your concerns are primarily health-based, and they'll reject your religious exemption. If you don't have a strong medical exemption, don't even file for a medical exemption. Just go with the religious. Finally, and this is the one that triggers people all the time, I recommend that you say in there that you know the vaccines are safe and effective. I know. If you can't bring yourself to do that, say you know the CDC says the vaccines are safe and effective. And just take that whole health and safety issue off the table out of your religious exemption letter. All right, does that make sense? So I really appreciate your attention. I'm getting the giant hook is coming for me right now. I'm not going to have to wrestle you for this, am I? Guys, thank you so much.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff Childers. Wow. Did I just learn a lot? You know, I went to the back of the room, and a young man actually gave me his medical exemption to fill out. And I just learned, one thing I definitely learned is that we're going to have to start hitting those religious exemptions